Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in this holiday season. We're glad to have you. We're recording this webinar, so those of you or friends or family who can't make it, you'll be able to watch it online. It is my pleasure to kick off our third aquaculture deep dive webinar, Seaweed Aquaculture in Rhode Island. We have two presenters for you tonight, Anoushka Concepcion from Connecticut Sea Grant. Anoushka is an associate extension educator focusing on marine aquaculture. She's based at the beautiful University of Connecticut Avery Point campus. Her programming focuses on supporting marine aquaculture in Connecticut, although she works nationally in many ways. She has a specific focus on the seaweed aquaculture industry in Connecticut. She works on developing guidance and addressing concerns with this nascent industry in Connecticut. She looks at everything from grow out to processing to market development and to permitting. She also leads the National Seaweed Hub, which we'll speak a little bit about today, which is a collaboration of 11 sea grant programs across the nation that addresses many of the similar emerging issues and concerns that we face here in New England. And then secondly, we'll hear from our very own Rob Hudson. He's joined our Rhode Island Sea Grant team just this year, and he helps to lead our fisheries and aquaculture portfolio. He has a master's from URI and is pursuing his PhD from URI as well in biological and environmental sciences. Rob has tons of experience in the aquaculture sphere, from working at Roger Williams University as adjunct professor and leading their hatchery, as well as teaching their applied shellfish farming course in years past. He's also worked in coastal and marine conservation and aquaculture for decades and hails as a Rhode Islander. So we're very blessed to have Robbie on our team, and very grateful to Anoushka and Robbie for presenting today. Very quickly, before I turn it over to Anoushka, we have, as with all of our presentations, they will be uploaded in the coming weeks to this website here. I'll put it in the chat, and then we'll link it to our very own Rhode Island shellfish website as well. So two places you can tune in and see that. Thank you so much again. Any questions, please do keep those in your brain, and also throw them into the chat, and we'll address them as we go. Wonderful. Anoushka, we'll turn it over to you. You should be set to share.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you. All right. And great. How does that look? Good?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to present today. My presentation will provide an overview of the seaweed aquaculture industry in the United States. I'll also talk about some current challenges, but also some innovative uses. So, let me just move this out of the way so I can see my screen better. I apologize. Get this bar out of the way. There we go. So for folks that are not familiar with what seaweeds are, just wanted to get a quick, provide a quick overview just so that we're all on the same page. So seaweeds are not plants. They may look like plants. They have structures that are very plant-like. However, they are a macroalgae. And so their physiology means that they grow in a different way than how terrestrial plants grow. There are three, let's see. There we go. There are three types of seaweeds. There's the reds, like Irish moss, browns, like sugar kelp, and greens, like sea lettuce. And really the color designation has to do with the type of photosynthetic pigments that each type of seaweed has in its tissue. So seaweeds are a part of a healthy coastal ecosystem. They provide habitat and food for organisms, but they're also very versatile in how we use them, how humans use them. So we eat them. They're a highly nutritious organism, and therefore we also use them in supplements. We incorporate them in some species in supplements, but they also have properties such as carrageenan that the red seaweeds provide, and so they're utilized in a lot of personal care products, and as well as fertilizers. So what I want you to take from this graph here is the black lines are the total, seaweed or biomass of seaweed that's harvested from the wild. And then the blue lines are the total seaweed that's harvested, or I'm sorry, that's cultivated. And so you can see, especially around the mid-1980s, that there's this huge shift from wild harvest to cultivation. And so most of the biomass globally is produced through aquaculture. And the largest aquaculture producers of seaweed are China, Korea, and Indonesia. So there's a variety of reasons of why folks are interested in farming seaweed. I'm just going to focus on really the two that sort of seems to be the most practical approach from a lot of maritime industries. And really that's to support year-round maritime operations. This works well for seasonal fisheries, especially the case in Maine with the lobster industry. And once this lobster season closes, that's the perfect season for cultivating seaweed. And so instead of having the employees for the operation go off and do something else, these businesses can retain their workforce throughout the entire year and just transition between different commodities. So really it's a way for them to just support the folks that they work with and to continue solidifying and strengthening and really being more resilient in our coastal economy. And there's really for shellfish farmers, I mean, it's really an ideal really excuse, I wouldn't say excuse, but to create diversification in the products that they offer. Shellfish farmers are already utilizing those grounds. And so it just sort of makes sense to add in another crop that is produced in harmony with the environment. And this is what's great about seaweed. It's a highly nutritious organism, highly nutritious crop, can be used in a variety of ways, but it is native to the areas that they're being cultivated in. There's a lot of regulations that prohibit the import of seaweed strains from even outside of state lines. So in Connecticut, we can't grow strains that are native to Maine. It has to be our local seed. So it makes sense. It belongs there. You can eat it, you can sell it, and so it's just a way to sort of, again, strengthen and make our coastal economies more resilient. So just a little bit of some information about the status of seaweed farming in the US. We've only been farming seaweed for just over a decade, so it's still a young industry. The primary species that we're producing are kelp, but it's sugar kelp specifically, Saccharina latissima. Primary production occurs mostly in the Northeast, and this is where the greatest number of farms are, specifically in the state of Maine. But businesses are mostly small scale. And we have a very short harvest season, anywhere between 2 to 3 months, depending upon the region that the kelp is being farmed in. But really the primary market outlet for cultivated seaweed is for human consumption. There's a lot of information on this table, but what I want you to focus on is that red box. So total cultivation, I should say proximate, total biomass produced across the nation is approximately 3 million pounds, with Maine and Alaska producing the largest amount of biomass. So 3 million may sound like a lot, but when we put it into perspective with, for example, wild harvest of rockweed, which is another type of kelp that is native to Maine, the state of Maine harvested from the wilds 15 million pounds of rockweed last year. So again, our industry in terms of cultivation, it's still small, but it is growing as more farmers get their permits and start putting lines in the water. But with any new industry, you're going to have challenges. And so that's where CRAC comes in to help folks navigate some of these challenges. But really a little bit about some of these challenges or barriers. These are really preventing our industry from expanding. Number one is access to established, consistent markets. 90% of our seafood is imported. And a large portion of that is seaweed in ready-to-use packaged forms. And it's also important to note that what we do import with seaweeds are not native to our coastal waterways. And so in a way, we can't just say, well, we can start growing dulse in Long Island Sound. Well, it's not native to Long Island Sound, so we can't grow it. So trying to compete with the cost of imports, which are also lower in price in many cases, can be challenging for farmers. Majority of farmers in Southern New England are selling their seaweed in its fresh whole form. And that's because we really don't have access to a lot of the infrastructure that's needed to increase shelf life of our seaweed. Because again, harvest season is only approximately 2 months. And so making seaweed available beyond the harvest season can be challenging. Now, I don't know if you've seen wild or freshly harvested kelp, but it is the most glorious thing that you've ever seen, but also ever tasted. And again, extremely nutritious for you. So having access to that infrastructure, long-term safe storage, processing, but also product development to compete with these products that are coming in overseas, making our product more novel, and then setting up food manufacturing facilities and companies is really what is the most immediate priority and barriers that our industry needs to address. And I added access to seed. This is not the case for everywhere across the US, but in Southern New England, it kind of is, because we're still reliant on wild stocks for our to produce our seed. And what we're noticing is with the rising sea surface temperatures, our kelp beds are sort of migrating northward. So really in Long Island Sound specifically, we're having a tough time to try and make sure that our industry is resilient. Moving over to the other coast, really in Alaska, their challenge is not finding seed, it's work is getting at, or I should say, being so remotely located from the closest commercial nursery. So for them, it's a bit of a different challenge, is being, in a location with Alaska's enormous coastline to try and get access to seed that way. So slightly different situation. But there are attempts to start addressing some of these barriers. There's nonprofits working in this area, but with Sea Grant, with the National Seaweed Hub that Azure mentioned, this is an effort with all the Sea Grant programs and their stakeholders to sort of do an assessment of what the challenges were, but then come up with responsive resources. So this is an example of a seaweed marketing toolkit that the marketing work group came up with. We have the nursery directory that the productions work group came up with through the Seaweed Hub, and then information about seaweed food safety. But also want to let you know that if you have a question about what's happening in another state, on the Seaweed Hub's website, here's a list of the Sea Grant colleagues that work in the area. So if you want to know what's happening in Alaska, you can contact, there's Rob, contact Missy in Alaska, and of course, Jacqueline Robidoux in Maine. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about what's happening in our state. And I wanted to just quickly talk about some of the other national projects that have been funded that came out of the result of the work that the Seaweed Hub has done to help address some of these barriers. So, for example, nursery production. Department of Energy, USDA, has put a lot of federal money towards helping to address this challenge. And it's really a collaborative effort between Bigelow Laboratories, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, UConn, as well as University of Southern California. And they are in the process of creating a gene bank to sort of store all the different strains from across the country. But most importantly, they're working on cross breeding. And so what I'm excited about is they're working on finding more temperature resistant strains of seaweeds, of sugar kelp, that we can hopefully start growing in Connecticut. There's also a lot of work being done on the food safety arena, especially when seaweeds are sold raw and fresh. And there's a lot of food safety hazards with raw foods, and seaweed is no exception. So seaweed food safety is something I've been working on in Connecticut for 8 years, and that's really set the stage to enable kelp farmers in Connecticut to not only be able to sell their kelp, but have regulators on the same page. And really what's great about this process is the state of Connecticut conducts all the testing for food safety and then issues a license to the farmer. So now it's a way the state saying is we are vouching for the safety of this product. So that's really exciting. And since the launch of this guide, seaweed producers are able to sell their kelp to whomever they would like to. And this is also another project to just help inform prospective farmers, but also current farmers that are trying to gauge what would make more sense for them in terms of the size of their farms, but also potential market outlets to keep that in consideration. And again, this is also multiple sea grant programs are involved in this project. Robbie's also involved in this project. And it's creating Excel spreadsheets where folks can input their numbers to help them decide, do I want to go big? Do I want to go small? Do I want to incorporate a nursery, or do I just want to do grow out and buy seed? But really what this does, it helps create enterprise budgets, cash flow statements, sensitivity analyses, but it also lets a farmer know the value of their kelp, which is really powerful to, when negotiating a price, when you're trying to sell your kelp, how much this kelp is worth. And so we'd like to see the seaweed industry become, or sort of be on par with other aquaculture commodities such as shellfish and shrimp and finfish, because we can create business plans for those commodities. Another component of this business planning guide or tool is an investment guide for investors to teach them about seaweed farming, but also life cycle analysis. So all of that can be incorporated together to really provide or sort of give farmers a tool to make themselves more marketable. I also want to talk about just some non-food applications that some of you may be familiar with. When I'm going through these, just kind of keep in mind, again, a lot of this depends upon infrastructure as well as scale up and the challenges with scale up. But again, Department of Energy is putting a lot of funding into looking at alternatives for fuel, and biofuels is one of them. And they're looking at seaweeds because of the lot of carbohydrate component that seaweeds have, to transition that into some sort of usable fuel. But again, this is really dependent upon not only the scale-up technology, but also having biorefineries available. And we also need a significant amount of biomass to help support this type of commodity or use for seaweed. There's also biotextiles. Something like sugar kelp has a lot of biopolymers that can be utilized to make bioplastics, biopackaging. And these two companies, Sway and Lalaware, are based in the US. Lalaware makes straws, and Sway makes this really beautiful translucent type of plastic that's compostable, which is key. And they're trying to address the scale-up issue for themselves. But again, it's also biomass and having a significant amount of biomass available to help support the development of these commodities. This is also a question I get asked a lot about cattle feed and incorporating seaweed into cattle feed to help reduce methane emissions or cow burps. And the target species right now that researchers are looking at is Asparagopsis, and that is a red seaweed that's not native to the lower 48, but it is native to the state of Hawaii, as well as the Mediterranean. And so Asparagopsis contains this compound called bromoform, and it's the bromoform that has been shown to reduce methane production in a cow's gut by almost 90%, so between 80 to 90%. And so there's studies looking at not only scale up, but the cost of the feed and what that would look like, but also looking at how incorporating seaweed would change meat quality or taste and milk quality or taste. But new research is coming out showing that there are some concerns, but again, very, very early research about the potential toxicity of bromoform. And so again, looking at alternative species to perhaps not incorporate so much, I should say Asparagopsis in feed. So again, still really early, but I think it's interesting, when you think about it, it's like we make 2 steps forward, we get 2 steps forward, and then when research comes out, it's like, oh, we have to take a step back, but that's okay. We can evaluate, figure out how to address it, and then move forward. One thing that I think is really exciting about seaweed is how we utilize the biomass. There's a lot of interest in making a claim that seaweed can combat climate change. Well, maybe the production itself can't, but the biomass can really be used in ways to help reduce the need or the reliance on very carbon intensive products. So for example, fertilizers for traditional large scale commercial ag, incorporating more seaweed means reducing less and less of the traditional type of fertilizers that we use. Seaweeds can, they're components that are being looked at as incorporating to soil amendments. And soil amendments are a good thing for agricultural crops because it just makes the crops grow better. And those derivatives are coming from seaweed. So again, just kind of thinking outside the box and non-food, there are lots of different potential uses for seaweeds that other states are working on. But I think it's really important to note that seaweed farming is a business, right? And so it has to be economically viable for everyone involved in the supply chain. But there's a lot of innovative work that I'm sure Robbie will talk about that is looking at some of the work that a lot of seaweed farmers are doing and incorporating into their business plans. And so with that, I'll just thank you for your time and looking forward to Robbie's presentation. Thank you so much for having me.
Anoushka, thank you. That was wonderful. While Robbie cues things up, what we'll have him do is just start his presentation because I imagine some of the questions you might have, Robbie is now going to immediately answer. So we'll just sort of hold questions, but if you want to not lose track of it, just pop it right into the chat. And Robbie, feel free to share. Thank you so much, Anoushka.
Everyone, just trying to figure out which screen I'm on. All right, so let's see.
That looks good, Robbie.
That, and let's move that bar out of the way for everybody. It's the problem with multiple monitors here. All right, so everybody sees just the full presentation right now?
You're good, Robbie. Yep.
All right, perfect. So hi, everybody. I'm Rob Hudson, and again, I'm with CRC, Coastal Resources Center here at the URI GSO campus in Rhode Island Sea Grant. And you may have caught, I'll be referencing a presentation I gave a couple months ago on just like overall aquaculture, and Azure has been placing those links inside of the chat. So feel free to, if I reference something that seems a little bit out of context, it's because I was mentioning it there. So we have seaweed aquaculture here in Rhode Island. So Anoushka, great job on everything national, regional, the issues. That is definitely some of the things that I do have in this presentation as well. And one of them is the, well, let's just start off by saying that, using and utilizing seaweeds in Rhode Island is not new. We just don't currently have an official wild harvest for seaweeds inside of Rhode Island waters. Whereas Maine has and continue to use a wild harvest of seaweeds as well as aquaculture products. So here in Rhode Island, over the years, what we've used seaweed for is, if you're familiar with clam bakes, I remember growing up in the 80s, we had these on the beaches. You get all the great food. Normally it's under a big pile of ascophyllum or fucus, so your knotted rack or your rockweeds, and you cook your food and insulate it through the rockweeds. And also fertilizer has been used here in Rhode Island as well as a few other uses. So we have used it for animal feeds and such like that, but right now it's more at well, I guess we'll call it a recreational scale, and it's not at a commercial scale. And then you may have saw in the graphic that Anoushka pulled together, Rhode Island has, well, let me step back. These photos I just want to point out are from me being up in Maine. These are not Rhode Island farmers. This is not Rhode Island scale currently in our state, but this is what we are producing. We have 3 active producers out of 10 permanent farms. We have 2 applications that are, one's a little bit further than the other, to actually have a few more lines in the water this winter. We have just over 14,000 pounds of sugar kelp that was landed in 2020. And again, this is, as I mentioned before in the previous webinar, this is farmer reported, which is a really good thing. It may sound scary, like, oh, the farmers are just doing their reporting, they can report whatever they want, but they're doing a great job of reporting of exactly what it is. And this is important for us as a state and me as an extension person to see, like, what are their needs. So if we have more and more production and we have more issues, we can hopefully work with funders and find ways to address some of those concerns. And if you also noticed in that graphic of all the states that Anoushka had up there, Rhode Island is like 4th in line as far as total production, which is pretty impressive of all the states that are producing some type of seaweeds. As mentioned, sugar kelp is our primary produced species. We have a short season, so the lines can go in the water starting in November, but they do have to be out of the water by May 1st. The seed spools that actually are deployed out there, those are either self-propagated, which I'll show you in a few slides a little bit later, or they're actually being bought by the private suppliers. So those are the means of ways to get the kelp onto your farm. And our primary markets currently are farm freshly harvested, raw to the processors, maybe to a chef or directly to a consumer is pretty much how the product is moving out. There is other avenues that the product is moving throughout Rhode Island, but those are the primary ones. Again, other potential reasons of why to grow it. This similar slide I presented before is just pictures to what Anoushka was saying. So you have cosmetic stuff up in the top corner. You have food like salsas, maybe some health supplements, maybe something for your pets at your house. For their meal supplements, same thing with if you have livestock. So you have a different type of product that is available to you. For any of the home gardeners, you have material that you can, this is liquid feed typically, so you can actually pour this out into your garden and use it as a liquid fertilizer. You can still go out there and harvest the wild stuff, let Mother Nature weather it a little bit and add it to your compost if that is your goal. Irish moss is Chondrus crispus. It's a native species to Rhode Island, and this is used as a clarifying agent. So again, if anybody's a home brewer at home, you may have a bottle of Irish moss sitting down there to clarify your home brews. Then there's kelpie beers, which is they're actively using kelp in the process of making the beer. And then Anoushka went through all these. So we already talked about feed, the fuel, cosmetic stuff, and fish feed, which is for marine finfish aquaculture or any finfish aquaculture. Is really important to get a good ratio of biomass of the fish to what you're putting into it. So it's right now in some of the situations in the feed, you just got to be concerned about harvesting too much of the wild finfish to produce some cultured fish. So potentially kelp and other algal species could help supplement that, and maybe we don't have to process fish to produce fish. So these are all the big picture items. These are all the things that potentially it could be, and some of the cases that what it is. And then this is most likely what the Rhode Island producers are going for. They're going to be looking at, they want to produce something local that's very healthy and nutritious, very delicious. I've had quite a bit of it. And so there's a lot of nutritional benefits to having fresh kelp or some process in some way. We also quickly mentioned ecosystem services before. So that could be the uptake of excess nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. A lot of people are leaning on it for the carbon, but if in a eutrophic estuary system, if there's an excess nitrogen and phosphorus, it potentially the seaweeds can actually be picking it up. Habitat creation, it could be in the short term. And then food, as always, could create habitats for finfish, a species for recreational purposes of harvesting. So a lot of different ecosystem services that are actually being provided by the seaweed and aquaculture of seaweed. This hasn't changed. This is the same graphic I threw up for shellfish aquaculture as well. So prior to site selection, the farmer has to think about all these things. So they got to think about the biology of what they're producing, the site characteristics, social concerns, permitting requirements that are out there. And that's basically how they're deciding on where they're going to put their lease. some of the farmers in Rhode Island, they're actually using this as an alternate crop, as Anoushka was saying, to either create a year-round production. So this is going to be considered a winter crop. So they may be focusing more on their oysters, but they can also produce kelp there. And the permitting is the same in Rhode Island. You have to go through a whole suite of things. The only difference, as I said before, there's actually a season to the kelp production. So, November to May. But other than that, it goes through the exact same process as all aquaculture in Rhode Island. These are the 4 main species up and down at least the region that we're focusing on here in the Northeast, with sugar kelp being the primary one for every state involved, wing kelp, skinny kelps, and gracilaria. So the gracilaria is the only red on this list, but the other species are all brown seaweeds. For sugar kelp specifically, we have a depth that's typically like 5 to 30 feet. If you have really clear water, you could possibly get it down to 100 feet in the natural habitats. Optimal ranges were about 50 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit, or 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. And then we have this source tissue formation. So as the water temperature is approaching 60 degrees Fahrenheit, you get the source tissue. The source tissue is this dark coloration right down the midrib of this blade of kelp right here. And that's the reproductive zone of that kelp. And then you have a tolerant range of 75 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's not that the kelp is going to be thriving in 75 degrees Fahrenheit. So as Anoushka was saying, you see a migration of many of our kelp beds moving north, and it's because with the warming waters, we're seeing some of the stuff moving north. So we have to be concerned about, what's the optimal range and when is it thriving? So that's that. This species, so the Cygler latissima, has a heteromorphic life cycle. So on this side of things, it's actually considered diploid. So it has genetic makeup. It has 2 chromosomes on this side. It only has 1 chromosome on this side, and it's separated off from basically male and female gametes, gametophytes at this side of the graphic. And that, I'll go back to that, think about gametophytes in a little bit. So with seaweed aquaculture, we have basically 2 phases. You have a nursery phase where you go out there, you collect all that source tissue that I just pointed out, you get a spore release, and then you start seeding your spools. And that's just all done inside of a facility, nothing that many of you are going to see. Then it comes the second half. So during the time frame when it's right, they're actually going to outplant that seed spool, and they're going to let it grow out there. There'll be some maintenance that has to be done on the farms, but other than that, is let it grow and then switch over to harvesting. This is a very general timeline for all of New England. So in the red is the Long Island, the blue is Maine's. So this is, I don't know what year this was, but this is what they're claiming to be the average water temperature throughout those months, throughout our entire year. And then you can see that the threshold here is at 18 degrees C. But as we get into here in Rhode Island, if you think about it, right, we're pulling out our kelp lines and everything in May. So we're still pretty cool water here. So we're still getting great growth that is suitable for that species versus bringing it up beyond that threshold. So our timelines actually shift a little bit here in Rhode Island versus especially northern parts of New England. And the same thing would apply to south of the Cape, so Connecticut and other parts of Massachusetts. So in Rhode Island, we have a nursery phase. It's in the literature in the previous one that says that we could start collecting our source tissue starting in September. Reality, that's more like mid-October that we could probably find some pretty solid source tissue available naturally from the natural beds that we have. And then, and then we have the grow outside. So after you collect the source tissue, it's going inside of into culture. Basically, again, you're going to be growing it out until May. With, as Anoushka mentioned, that you have about a couple of times that you can actually harvest it. So sometime in maybe late March or early April, mid-April, you could get some more harvest besides just the final harvest and slug at the very end of the season. So what happens inside of the nursery system? Well, you've collected that source tissue. You can definitely see this midrib right here. So you collected that, you clean it all up by disinfecting it, you chill it for a little bit, and you're going to determine the readiness to see if you can get a spore release. And if you notice on this paper towel over here, all this brown area, this is kind of assessing if whether or not that that blade is ready for a spore release. And then we're going to get into if you get a spore release, so you're going to count the density. So in these two figures down here, you have a beaker that has some source tissue inside of there. You can see that water is relatively clear. You look at this beaker right here, it's very cloudy looking. That's the spore release that's taking place inside of that beaker with that source tissue that was placed in there. The producer would calculate the average cell densities. I just threw that in there, left the average is 5,000 to 10,000 cells per milliliter, just to let you get an idea of how much is actually being, how many spores are actually being released during this process. That's what the average that you're hoping that is still available. So we have spores are set onto these tubes. So this is a seed spool right here. So you have, there's actually a string that is used with held in place with a couple of rubber bands on either side. And this is all wrapped around a PVC tube. And then this right here is placed inside of another larger PVC tube, and you actually pour your spores on the outside ring of this, and the inside of the larger PVC, but on the outside of the one with the string attached to it. And then that's what you're hoping to cultivate. You're going to maintain everything at 50 degrees Fahrenheit and let it go. So this is a possible setup that somebody could have. So this is something that somebody could actually set up inside of the basements. And you have, this is the light stands. You can see on either side. There's going to be weekly maintenance to this. There is daily maintenance. There's weekly maintenance. There's definitely a lot of work to produce these spools inside of these aquarium tanks. And this is what you're hoping to see as the days go on. So by day 26, you start to see some of the spores out there, and definitely as you move through the process, you can get up to day 40, and this is at the time when you need to be moving that out to your grow outside. This is a kelp spool that has got some setting onto it, and we talked about some of the things, advances in research that's been going on. This is definitely one of those advances in research. This right here could be a big game changer, especially for the Rhode Island and the Southern New England resources. And the reason why this is such a game changer, remember when I was talking about the different stages? So if you think of if it was just one end, so basically one male gametophyte versus one female gametophyte, the male will be in one, the females will be in the other. This thing is just like a blender. So they're able to, in easiest ways to explain it, they chop it up continually on a time frame, and it basically constantly reproduces through that fragmentation. And with that keeps it, you can keep these cultures going year round, and then you can scale it up just before the season. So that way, if you can put your lines in the water on November 1st, on November 2nd, you can be putting your spools out, which would give us an additional month or two to actually grow and cultivate these species here in Southern New England, which would be extremely useful and beneficial to increase production here. Some of the other methods have been changing. Like I was telling you, like you pour the spores around the seeding tube. Other people are now putting them inside of a spray bottle, and that way they're spraying it directly onto the string. You're getting a nice even distribution of all those spores across the entire string of spool string, and you're able to hopefully get a better crop out of that as well. So some of the methods, the technology, all this is changing definitely at all levels, but here in the nursery section first and foremost. So this is just, some of these are going to be example farms, like just like something that was from this publication that kind of gives you a rough idea of what you would be looking at, or what you would kind of be proposing in order to develop your own farm site. So all this is grown on submerged horizontal long lines on a licensed farm. Again, the season, as I mentioned before, this is a winter crop. Not so much that you're harvesting during the winter, but your harvest is growing during the winter while you're maybe you put your oysters to bed. Maybe some people are just sinking them, or maybe you're still harvesting some of your oysters. So you set it up in a way that it doesn't disrupt your day-to-day operations. It's a simple farm design, relatively low startup cost. It really depends on how big you make it. So this makes it an interesting access point that many of the farmers can get involved with it. That's why there's 10 permitted farms inside Rhode Island, only though that 3 were active as the past year, but it has potential to allow entry into this field. So if you were to go out, this is a cross cut. So you have your basically your end of the line markers, your mooring balls. You have your seed line, which is where your kelp will be growing off of. You have these spacers, but they're labeled here as control lines with weight and buoy, which is this figure right here. So you have a lobster pot buoy. You have this chunk of PVC, and it's spliced into the line, which is this backbone right here. And then you have a weight. So you're basically trying to float and sink your kelp lines. That way it stays at the perfect depth. And then you keep on adjusting your weights to make sure things are looking good. This is an example of a farm that may want to use a floating aquaculture technique at the top part during the summer times in spring and fall. But during the winter time, they might sink their techniques, so their method of grow out, these oyster grow setups, and then actually have the kelp growing. So now this is what most people think of integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, where you have one product over or above another, or within a upwards or downstream of where the other species is being cultivated. In theory, if you were getting 5 pounds a foot, if you had 3 acres, and with 9,000 feet of that kelp line, you're producing about 45,000 pounds of seaweed. Again, that's assuming 5 pounds per foot and how much line that you're actually deploying. And then we have the seeding of the farm. So right here, we got the young sporophyte. You can just see it right on here. So this is that C string that was already deployed. This larger string right here is going to be your backbone, your long line system. We already said when we're out planting it, it's typically you're hoping for November, may not be into December, depending on what's going on inside of the nursery systems. A line is passed through this PVC. So that's your long line is coming through this PVC, and the seed is spooled out off of the end as it passes through. So hopefully this video works for everybody. And you have this line just being spooled out nice and easy. And you can see your floats over here. This is your long line, and then this is your C string wrapping around that long line, kind of like a helix. So farm maintenance is keeping the lines, making sure they're not crossing, assuring that the anchors, make sure like if a storm is coming through that none of the anchors are getting letting loose. You want to keep the lines, like as I mentioned, at the proper height. And your hope is that you're going to see 5 to 10 foot blades, and you're hoping to harvest about 5 pounds per foot. Again, this is the spacers, so this is what you're doing for maintenance. The other thing to think about, in Maine, they call these lollipops because they'll color code them to make sure that it's an easy visual way to make sure that you're not crossing your lines. Some of the things that are being done locally, we have looking at, again, more for agriculture, some more research that's going on at a commercial scale. Soil amendments, as we mentioned before, that's also being looked at locally. Ecosystem services that are possibilities such as removal of nitrogen, phosphorus, and such. Students mentoring. So now we get into some of the environmental education potential and getting people familiar with what's going on with kelp aquaculture or seaweed aquaculture. Advantages, again, it's a winter crop, be grown in the off season, basically when most of your other gear is possibly inactive, that you're not getting that many calls and sales. Winter kelp farms, you're able to diversify your crop, which is great. If you look at many of the land farms in Rhode Island or in many other locations, you definitely want to see a diverse crop. You don't want monoculture, is not typically ideal. Way to increase seafood production, we talked about that, and the ecosystem services. Some of these bottlenecks, Rhode Island's not immune to it. We have the same concerns that the rest of the nation is having right now. We have it's an early young market for it to get the word out that we're producing this stuff here. We have conflict uses because of the shared space that we're all trying to utilize, and for both recreational and for commercial value. Large quantities, it's all, potentially you don't want to dump it all in the market at the same time. That could drive down prices. And then you want to be careful about where the product is being sold to or how it's being processed. Currently in southern New England, we don't have any post-harvest processing, so this added value product, whether it's drying it, some of the flash freezing, anything that we do have is going to have to be done get approved by DOH and be done by the farmer themselves. So it's not like we have a large facility. There's other means that people have to work around. We have a very short harvest season, as mentioned before. Price points for sale, again, dumping too much on the market all at once could be a bad thing. So depending on where you enter it into the supply chain could change how much, and also depending on what part of the kelp. So we talked about it's not a true plant. It has that middle portion was a stipe. So you might be able to sell the stipes separate more to agricultural production and keep the blades for human consumption. And then local growth, is definitely 5 pounds per foot is definitely a great marker. It's not necessarily what we're seeing in southern New England in many cases. Not every place. It's very site specific, so it has to be looked at. There's more research that's going on. So potential supply chain issues was looked at back in 2018 out of CRC and Sea Grant with funding from USDA. We also have a kelp harvest week for New England, which is great. So the photos in the first photos that I showed you where there was boats harvesting, that was Anoushka and I were at the National Seaweed Symposium. The second one, we were in Maine. That was one of the trips that I was on. But that was during Maine's Kelp Week, which is great. You can find locations of where to buy some of the local stuff from down here in southern New England. So make sure you can check out some of these pages. There is a cooperative with southern New England farmers. So we have 5 farmers, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, that are partaking into this. They're going at it so that way there's more people involved and they're hoping to address some of these issues as a cooperative. And then you can see 2024, we're already expecting, it should be the last week of April, should be the kelp harvest week. And that's because that's when we're getting it all out into the market. If you happen to find one of those places, you can, like if you're growing like your home garden stuff. So me at home, I've tried some drying and fermenting of different products I grow in the garden at the house. But if you go out there and purchase some of this kelp, these are things that you could do yourself too. You can eat it fresh directly, and recipes are always coming online. Ferment it yourself or dry it out. So there's other things that you could be doing yourself, and you can see the shelf life. Some additional resources that are available, and Azure has been posting most of these in the chat. And yeah, that's it. I found this picture. At full disclosure, I have not had this, but this looks amazing to me. So you got a sugar kelp lasagna basically with some rock shrimp, haddock, and cheese, oyster cream. So this is great. So anyways, that's it.
Robbie, that's wonderful. Thank you. Feel free to keep your slides up because we might go back to them. And I just see, Jane, you have a question about getting a dehydrator / facility in southern New England. So there, I know there is interest in that. There's an expense to purchasing that. And then certainly, the industry sort of has to work together to share the use of that. Not individual growers, kelp farmers can't really afford to have a dehydrator each. So there's sort of that. but I know there is some interest, and then having a sustained space to keep that, and then paying for the energy cost associated with that. I know there's, it's an incredibly energy inefficient to run a dehydrator. So that's one thing where there's, the benefits of farming kelp that have sort of some environmental upsides, and then you go and process it with a highly energy intensive system. So Maine, Anoushka, you might know the company that owns it, has a very big dehydrator. So there's strides being made. And again, like Anoushka and Robbie said, Maine is really leading the way in that.
Yeah, Ocean Balance is one of the, has a new
That's
one.
it. Ocean's Balance. Something else to consider with a shared dehydrator facility, there's also food safety concerns, and ensuring that there's no cross-contamination and that it's sanitized properly. But that again, once investment is made in a facility, then some of the other best management practices and sanitation can also be addressed. But we need investment.
Thanks, Anoushka. And it looks like any other questions, feel free to come off mute. Oh, there's or type it into the chat. Anybody have anything? Again, we'll be posting this. Anoushka, would you mind putting your contact info as well into the chat? We have Rob's up there. Thank you. Beautiful. Any other thoughts? Well, wonderful. Thank you all once again for joining us. Thank you, Anoushka and Rob, for presenting. And please look for the slides and the recording on that website. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday season. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.